Hi and welcome to the Philosopher's Games. Today we have a look at the For Honor multiplayer. Note that my impressions are mainly from the PC open beta and I don't claim to be good at this game. Also, the game looks much better on higher settings. But let's start. Overall, I enjoyed For Honor a lot. It's basically a 3D fighting game with more modes than just 1v1. The game has of course the classic dual 1v1 mode, but in addition a dual 2v2, 4v4 and a conquest mode called Dominion, where you have to hold areas on the map for tickets and get 1000 tickets to prevent the enemy team from respawning. With this in mind, the first and probably most important question is, how is the combat? The base concept of the combat is to divide the screen into 3 sections, left, right and top, and with this you can determine the direction of your attacks and your block, or let's say your defensive capabilities. If you select left and press attack, you will attack the left side of your opponent. If your opponent wants to simply block that attack, he needs to select the same side and keep his neutral position. A bit similar to Mount and Blade's combat system. Those arrows are your indicator and will only be shown if you are in the so-called guard mode. That often means you have locked on to your enemy. In addition, the game has several mechanics and counter mechanics tagged onto the system, like parries, the so-called guard breaks and counter guard breaks, throws, attack cancelling and feints, stamina management and dodging. Combine this with 12 different heroes that also play different and modify some mechanics a bit, and you have a relatively complex game. And I have to admit, I really liked the combat for the most part. It can lead to some fairly tense moments where you and your opponent are low on health, both with no stamina left, the characters are breathing heavily, and both of you know the next hit will decide the winner. They really nailed this medieval warriors fighting each other theme, and it's great. All this is supported by a great atmosphere and stellar animation work. The animation in For Honor is nothing less than impressive. It's a piece of art. Not even once I saw a combat animation that was off a bit, looked weird or had no proper impact. I always knew what hit me and the hit feedback is spot on. In addition, you have tons of little details in the animation that makes the world and the characters feel alive. The in-game HUD and supporting particle effects also work great. The indicators communicate clearly what is going on in the battlefield and in combat. Only guaranteed hits in combos that are not blockable if the prior attack hit you could be communicated a bit better, but you have to learn them anyway because they are often very fast and maybe that's a deliberate design decision. The sound design goes hand in hand with the HUD design, and so you have tons of audio cues that also indicate what is going on, and you don't notice it because it's so natural. Audio-visual communication is top-notch in For Honor. Also, the game looks beautiful and runs smoothly on my old machine. Only recording hit my frame rate hard. A lot of praise, but the game also has some problems, even though I would consider most of them minor or only relevant if you get really good at the game. The first complaint that comes to mind are the menus. Of course, you can handle them with a controller or mouse and keyboard, so the developers had to make some compromises, but there are often so many sub-menus that it gets really confusing. You often have so much text and little features that it overwhelms a new player, and you have to search for things. It is pretty much the opposite of the in-game HUD. It often needs an absurd amount of button presses to do quite simple tasks. It also doesn't help that they had to build this Faction Wars minigame into it too, which creates more buttons to press and more information to be presented. And of course, you can get loot too. And of course, you have to manage this too, which is annoying busy work, especially since you can accidentally equip your new loot from a match after spamming the OK button to end all those progress information screens faster. The amount of time you have have to press OK or fiddle through some menus is just too high for me and very annoying. Also, the game menus often do a poor job communicating what is going on. And even though the game often tries really hard to explain its mechanics to you, and I think it often does a great job here, the tutorial videos are, for example, very helpful and I recommend watching them. But sometimes it flat out fails hard. Maybe it's just the beta. For example, for me, the Faction Wars minigame was very confusing at the beginning, even though there is not much to explain. How do those war assets work? Where can I place them? What happens if I forgot to place them? How are the percentages calculated? Or loot, what do some of those item stats do exactly? You can figure it out, but sometimes it's more complicated than it needs to be. Let's move on. Let's dive into some problems I have with the combat. It is somehow strange or even a good compliment for the game, but I think all heroes are viable. Maybe not at the highest skill level, but only few players are there yet anyway, and balancing can be patched, even though balancing itself is very difficult, of course. Sure, some heroes have a harder time against a specific other hero, but that works from my perspective. One problem I have is that some heroes seem, from my noob level perspective, very limited in their options, and this leads to boring 1v1 fights. I mainly played the Warden, and I think this character is quite easy, but has at least a few interesting tools and is very complete. But look at the Conqueror or the Warlord. While very powerful, compare them to some of the Asian samurai characters. They have built-in attack cancels and can easily attack cancel into other attacks. That is part of their DNA. Don't get me wrong, that is not OP or too strong at all. In fact, the heavy characters like the Conqueror are very strong right now, but some of these Asian characters seem just more interesting, if you understand what I mean. I feel like their toolbox has just more interesting tools, and I say that not really playing those characters, so take it with a grain of salt. Another thing I dislike to some degree is the map emphasis on, let's call them ring outs. This is mainly a problem or frustrating if you are new to the game. You can kick characters off a cliff, which sounds fun. While it is fun, and I would also argue that it's or can be necessary in the Dominion mode, I would say it often feels a bit off in 1v1s. I guess environmental damage is fine because it is easier to avoid if the map is designed well. But on some maps you are fighting on a small bridge and the match can easily evolve around who will land his guard break or charge attack first. You can do really well on a bridge, slowly reducing the health pool of your opponent, but all he needs to do is grab you once with you reacting a tiny bit too late and he wins. I'm personally not a big fan of that. I like having space in duels. I would say in 4v4 Dominion mode it is a nice addition because you often come into situations where one player is outnumbered, but in a 1v1 and maybe 2v2 environment I don't like the scenario much because in beta you had only one map where it wasn't really a factor. Another minor problem with the combat is that stamina costs are at the beginning very confusing. Of course you learn them over time, but when you are new you look at your stamina and it's at 70% and suddenly it's gone. When I just started it felt a bit inconsistent, even though I learned after some time that it isn't. Stamina costs in For Honor are just not very intuitive, and from my perspective the game needs an information page or something on this topic. It does not clearly communicate what move costs what amount of stamina in what situation. Another problem with the combat is that defense in this game feels far too strong, at least if you are very good at the game. The counterplay for defense is sadly quite limited. You only have unblockable attacks, charge attacks and guard breaks, but all are easily countered. parries are very easy to pull off with some practice and not only negate unblockable attacks if they are slow, but also allow you to punish them, which leads to the situation that attacking with slow attacks is pretty much a mistake if the enemy is very good. The guard break can be easily countered and most charges, grabs, throws are just too slow. This can lead to very boring fights. Losing your stamina also doesn't influence your defensive capabilities that much, and you can just wait and block everything if you are good, without having a disadvantage. Not to mention that blocking doesn't cost stamina at all. With this said, the current balancing and game design has a big problem in balancing out offense and defense. That means at a high skill level, attacking offensively is often a mistake and leads to players feinting pretty much all attacks because it is the only tool that can open up the enemy, and maybe searching for so-called option selects. Forcing players to be afraid to attack is not good for a competitive fighting game. But keep in mind, this is only true if you are really good at the game. When you watch me play, I do so many mistakes, do input errors and miss opportunities all the time, because I'm an idiot and bad at the game, even though I understand it in theory. But if you are actually good, those mistakes will happen quite rarely. This is also the reason why the Warden is considered so strong, because his shoulder vortex is so fast, cancelable, and you can chain it very easily with fast light attacks. This messes with defense a lot and makes the enemy guess, which allows the Warden to be more offensive. Adding to this problem, running away in 2v2 and 4v4 duels also feels a bit too strong too. It's quite hard to punish if an enemy just decides to run away from you, and the boosts you can pick up can also reward it. Even if they don't win in the end or don't get an advantage, they start just wasting your time. In Dominion 4v4 it's again a bit different, since kills do matter far less and you can just respawn if the enemies haven't reached 1000 points yet. I would also say reviving needs a little tweak, since it also feels a bit strong. I also think that this isn't a game that you can play indefinitely, or let's say for thousands of hours. After 4 days of beta, I was still excited, but I see me stop playing it at some point, because I noticed how fights got similar, seeing me using the same attacks and patterns over and over, while feeling that your tools are somewhat limited. But don't get me wrong. It took a lot of time for me to feel that way, and you will get a lot of playtime out of this. It's just not Dota or League of Legends or let's say World of Warcraft levels of playtime. But I often hear people complain when they only got 70 to 200 hours of playtime out of a multiplayer focused title, so keep this in mind. Some of those minor issues are a bit subjective, and some will only be problematic if you played it quite a lot. If we look at technical issues, I have only encountered some matchmaking and connection problems. The game had 2 to 3 little bugs like getting stuck on a ladder, but I assume those are fixed right now in the release version. A friend of mine also played with mouse and keyboard only, and it works, but he got a bug where the mouse cursor was not going away in-game, which was really annoying for him. Should you plan on playing it with mouse and keyboard and you hear about this bug being still in the game, you probably should wait until it's fully fixed. For me, the beta ran quite good and I haven't encountered many technical issues. Now, is it worth $60 or euros? Well, the single player seems quite short, with 6 to 8 hours, and some voices say it's not bad, but the game is clearly focused on multiplayer. So I would only say yes if you really want to dive deep into the multiplayer. And here, keep in mind that without patches, a better balance between offense and defense, new content, new heroes and more interesting tools, I don't see the game reaching Dota, StarCraft or World of Warcraft levels of playtime. If you're okay with that, then give it a try. If you expect a highly complex fighting game that you can play for 2000 hours, this is probably not for you. So my conclusion, For Honor has great combat as long as you are still exploring it and does many things right. Even though it has, from my perspective, some minor issues, I can see this game succeed, and I have to admit I had a blast playing it. If you want to get into multiplayer, you have to consider that it requires practicing and learning like a fighting game, even though it doesn't seem to be as complex as the top tier fighting games. If you don't want to be destroyed online, you will need to invest some time and maybe lose some duels until you get better. You can also play it with friends. Everything is better if you play it with friends. But if you don't want to play the multiplayer at all, I'm not sure if the single player alone is worth the price. I would recommend waiting for a sale. Animation is really impressive, graphics and sound are great, and audio-visual communication is on a high level. Overall, the game feels fairly competent put together. Only the menus need some work. All that said, if you like 3D fighting games to some degree, enjoy the Knight, Viking, Samurai setting, and want a game that you can play a lot but maybe not thousands of hours, then For Honor could be a game for you. Ubisoft also announced map and game mode DLCs to be free, which is also a thing to consider. And that wraps up my video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it somewhat helpful. If you liked it, consider following me on Twitter for updates or do the YouTube things. Thank you for watching and goodbye.